and get started. Welcome everyone to the second in our Playbook Masterclass series. I'm really excited for the topic on deck today. We think about the sort of intentionality around measure, tech, and ops really being that shared foundation for developing and deploying digital clinical measures across public health, patient care, and clinical research. So welcome everyone. I am going to hand off to my tremendous colleagues today, but before I do, we will do just a little bit of housekeeping first in case you haven't attended a DIME webinar or a Playbook Masterclass series yet. Just a quick note, we always do want to notify people when things are being recorded, so today's session is indeed being recorded. Christine, Chris, and Andy will take you through a terrific set of opening remarks, and then we are going to throw this open to your questions, and we welcome your participation. There's a couple of ways you can do this. Right from the start, you can pop your questions into the Q&A function. We will try and answer those live. We will call on you if you are able to unmute yourself. And we will also try and have the full group adding comments and really try and get you as much information as you can. We'll also, if you'd like to ask your question directly, you can feel free to raise your hand, not like this, but in the participant listing, there is a button you can press, it will raise your hand, we will unmute you, and you can ask your question live. And as I said, the session is being recorded, and the recording and the slides will be available on playbook.dimesociety.org after today's session. So with that, that's enough of me. I'm really excited to hand over today's instructors, Christine, Chris, and Andy, my wonderful colleagues from the Playbook. Thank you for leading this afternoon session, and it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. So excited to be here. Today we're going to walk you through the beginning section of the playbook that talks about the concept that order matters and moving through measures, technology, and operations. So I'll do a bit on measures, Andy's going to do a bit on technology, and then Chris will do a bit on operations. So first, let's just start with some intros. So I'm Christine. I started my career in health services research at academic institutions and hospital systems. I'm the research lead at Electra. Prior to joining Electra, I worked at Citi, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, building their database of feasibility studies of mobile technologies used in research. I'm also a research lead at DIME, where I've done some work on standards and meaningful measurement selection, which plays nicely into the playbook discussion for today. Andy, you want to go?
Yes, I'm Andy Corvos. I am the CEO and co-founder at Electra Labs. I previously served in the digital health unit at the FDA, so I've been thinking a lot about how to use these different types of sensors and wearables and what are the roles for our regulators in making sure that we can bring these to market safe and effectively, and have really been excited to work on this playbook in particular for two reasons. One, sleep is sleep and heartbeats are heartbeat, and I think that these should really be considered similarly across clinical trials, care, and public health. And so having these developed differently doesn't make a lot of sense, which is what we're going to talk about today for that foundational work. And the second thing I'm excited about is everything you're going to see today was published open access Creative Commons. And what that means is you can download it, you can remix it, you can share it, you can put your logos on it, even commercially. So our goal here is to help you get a foundation and set of resources. So you're welcome to screenshot, but even better, we'll give you the Google Slides link and you can pull all of this into the work that you do every day.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Benko. I'm the CEO of Conexa Health. We're a company that develops and implements digital biomarkers specifically for the pharmaceutical industry and the development of novel medicines. I spent my entire adult life, and it looks like that might even be my intern picture, at Merck prior to starting Conexa. So a lot of really my entire career has been in and around drug development. I'm also an advisor to Takeda Pharmaceuticals R&D organization, and really proud to be part of the Digital Medicine Society since early days. It's been fantastic to be a part of this initiative to bring together the playbook for me, particularly because we brought together a diverse group of stakeholders to provide input in such a rapid period of time. So what you're seeing has unfolded literally all over the course of 2020. In fact, not even at the beginning of 2020, we probably started around March. And we've put together what I think is a really focused set of resources and input that can be useful to stakeholders across the system as well as to regulators, that brings together a lot of shared experience from great organizations that I'm thrilled to be working with.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, attendee poll. Jen, we have a Zoom poll for the attendees to see if you attended the Playbook launch. So yes, either no, but you watched the recording, or no, you didn't attend the Playbook launch. Everyone could just take a couple seconds to fill this out. It'll be helpful for us to do some of the background information. Okay, 63% yes, or 66% yes, that's great. Some recordings and some no's. Okay, then I'll spend a little bit of time on some of the intro slides so people can get a sense for that. Okay, so this is the Creative Commons license that Andy mentioned. So this is in here, this is in the main Playbook slides as well that you can download. And our intention here is that you can take it, you can use it. We encourage you to do so with attribution back to the Playbook. So we hope you guys will be able to use this resource. So this is kind of the origins for why remote monitoring is important. And I think many people on this call will know that, that remote monitoring gives us a more holistic view of a patient's lived experience with disease. So we're able to catch these invisible data points through continuous monitoring that in-clinic visits just couldn't get before. Which is really exciting. So remote monitoring can be deployed across clinical research, clinical care, and public health. And like Chris and Andy mentioned, we believe that there are synergies across these three areas for how the different elements can be deployed successfully. So why now? Why do this endeavor around the Playbook? Consumer companies like Apple, Verily, Fitbit, they've recently gotten clearances from the FDA. Clinical trials run with a low rate of technical success. Healthcare costs are extremely high. And COVID has really been an accelerant around this to get momentum to move healthcare out of the hospital and out of the clinic and into the patient's home. So this is a really exciting time to be a part of this great work. So we saw an opportunity for collaboration around measures and making sure that that happens in the best interest of the patient. So like Andy mentioned, we believe that heartbeat is a heartbeat and that sleep is sleep. So we wanted to not be competing on endpoints. So there's no Pfizer blood pressure, there's no Novartis blood pressure, it's just blood pressure. And then that allows us to select measures that truly matter to patients and define some similarities in how those measures can be deployed across clinical research, clinical care, and public health. So like I said, our goal is to build this shared foundation so that we have some synergies across these three areas. Well, this describes a bit of the tour of duty. Like Chris mentioned, we spend a lot of time on this. Open to public comment. We encourage your feedback and encourage you to sign up for the next tour of duty as well if you're interested in continuing this work.
Just as a pause there, this is not a fake invitation. This is a very real invitation. So if you're on this call, you are eligible to join the tour of duty. We will not necessarily right now go into details about what that is, but if that sounds interesting for you, put a note in the chat. Or Jen, what's the best way for people to alert their interest?
That's a really terrific idea, Andy. Actually, ping me here in the chat. There's also a form at playbook.dimesociety.org where people can sign up and I can send along more information. Todd, I saw you putting your name in. If you want to send me your email privately, I will make sure you get some more information.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jen. And then it's important to mention that the Playbook stands on the shoulders of giants. The Playbook really serves as a stitching between existing products or existing projects across these great companies. And we wanted to recognize these groups for their contributions to the field in the spotlight pages throughout the Playbook. And we aim to support a broader ecosystem to create spaces for these types of collaboration. So again, we wanted to highlight some organizations that are doing some great work in this space. And if you don't see your organization here and you think it should be, definitely reach out to us as well. Okay. So this gets into the measures, technology, operations piece that we'll talk about today. So you can view this playbook as your checklist for remote monitoring. So just as a pilot goes through a checkoff before takeoff in an airplane, and that checklist looks the same no matter if you're flying a Boeing or something else, you follow the same processes. You can follow the same processes across clinical research, clinical care, and public health to implement remote monitoring. So the playbook builds this shared foundation that first starts with measures. What do you want to measure and why? What's going to be important to your patient population? Once you identified that, you can move into technologies. What are the right tools for the job, which Andy will talk about. And then operations. So what's going to be needed to deploy these technologies at scale? And Chris will talk about that section. So we'll walk you through the details of each of these elements. Order matters. By following the foundational steps of measures, technology, operations, you're going to avoid common pain points. This process will be more efficient, and you'll be able to keep patients at the center of it all, which is ultimately what's most important here. So these are some examples of pain points that you can run into if you do this process out of order. So if you start with technologies first, like I saw this cool Apple Watch at a conference, let's deploy it. You might end up realizing that that Apple Watch doesn't have the right sensors, or it doesn't have the right sampling capacity or the sampling rate to get what's going to be most meaningful in your patient population. Similarly, you could just deploy the smartwatches, but you realize that that technology might have issues with Bluetooth, or then there's a security incident. And in that case as well, you end up with unusable data. So by starting with the measures, what your patients tell you is important, and then following its technology, then operations, you're going to avoid those pain points. Okay, I'm gonna dig into measures a bit. So patient engagement throughout this measurement process is vital to the success. Right before the playbook launched, this peer-reviewed piece was published in Digital Biomarkers, which is a piece that I co-wrote with Bray Patrick Lake of Evidation and Jen Goltzak of GEM, to really put the patient into focus here in digital measurements. Because what we don't want to happen is an entrenchment of some of the poor traditional measurements. We don't want those to proliferate and then become burdensome for patients. What we want to do is find better high quality measurements that can more accurately capture what patients are telling us that is most meaningful for them to see change in their daily lives. So the process that we work through in the playbook starts with the meaningful aspect of health. Then you move into a concept of interest. Then you move into your clinical measure. So a meaningful aspect of health is the aspect of a disease that the patient doesn't want to become worse, wants to improve, or wants to prevent. I like to think about the meaningful aspect of health as something that the patient tells you in their own words. So it'll be very practical, something that they're experiencing in their day-to-day. So like, I have trouble falling asleep, or I want to be able to walk around the grocery store. Very practical, like real life things. Once you identified your meaningful aspect of health, you can then move into a concept of interest. So that's the more specific, narrow element that you can practically measure within the scope of your clinical trial or clinical care or public health scenario. Once you identified that, you'll move into your outcome to be measured, which is specific. I like to think of outcomes as having time and unit domains, so that's a specific element that your connected sensor or ePro, but this is focused on connected sensors, can actually collect. And then lastly, you'll get your endpoint if you're in clinical research. So when we talk about outcomes, sometimes people get confused between what's a biomarker and what's a clinical outcome assessment. There are multiple types of clinical measures, and those include both outcomes and COAs, or clinical outcome assessments. The playbook does go into this in a couple more detailed sides within the clinical trial section, but I wanted to put it here as a information for you if you're interested in this. It goes into more detail in section 3.1. And then these are some case examples of what that meaningful aspect of health, concept of interest, or clinical measure might look like. So for example, in a Parkinson's population, they might tell you, I want to be able to walk so I can carry my groceries. And maybe you collect that information by doing patient interviews or a focus group. And then you're able to say, okay, how can we practically measure that in our clinical trial? That might look like activity, more specifically walking capacity. That can be measured and assessed. So then from there, you'll get into your outcome that has time domains attached to it, and then your endpoint, which is how you want to measure this change. Okay, Andy, technologies. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm muted. So also just for people as you're going, this playbook is 400 pages long, which we recognize is a bit of a beast. We are selecting some of the sections that are more focused in here. And then if there's any questions that come up, for example, I know that the question around like, is it a biomarker or is it a measure is a big one that people have. Please use the Q&A chat. We're going to be monitoring that. And then we will also be updating and answering these questions as we go. We're going to do questions in two ways. Sometimes we might answer directly for the teammate who's not speaking. So you might get a more real-time answer. And then we also will open for Q&A. And so our intent here is to give you a set of language and frameworks to think about these things. And we also know that many of the terms that we're using are new. And so please think about, and give us feedback on that process. So for example, we're going to go into the technology section now, and we intentionally do not use the term device. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we think about that process. So the device is really a term of art for regulators. So the FDA calls something could be a device or not a device. And that doesn't always necessarily mean the same thing of whether or not something is necessarily like a device colloquially. So we'll do a poll, or not really a poll, I'll do a quiz. So is the Apple Watch a device per FDA terms? I'm going to monitor the chat and see what people are saying. Okay, so, we get mixed. So one person says no, not regulated by the FDA. Somebody else says yes. What other thing? So is the Apple Watch a device? We're getting yes as the winner. Depends how you use the watch. Excellent. Okay, great. So we'll get into some of these more. The Apple Watch itself is not technically a device. Apple has gotten 2 software as a medical device, SAMD, clearances that are used on the watch. And so there are different components that are used on the watch that might be, and so software itself can be a device without the hardware components, and that's coming out through the FDA. So what we're going to go through in this section is really talking about the technology pieces, and that might include the hardware, that might include the algorithms, and that might also include other sorts of data elements that you're using. As you think about the different types of technologies, it's really about thinking about, do the benefits outweigh the risks? None of these things are completely riskless. If it's connected to the internet, it has risk because anything that's connected to the internet can be hacked, and we'll talk through that. So it's really about managing benefits versus risk. Here, when we think about the technology ecosystem, we can think about the sensor that collects these data. We can think about the algorithms that process that information and the data science platforms that might support that. And then that would feed into probably a larger patient data platform, and the technology ecosystem goes across all of these. So next slide. We're not advocating one or the other. We also think it's really helpful to see some examples of what we might mean in some of these instances. So a sensor, and to be clear, the focus of this playbook is around remote monitoring technologies, which are sensor derived. So anything that's survey derived is very important in research and in care, and not part of the scope of what this playbook covers. So there's a sensor. Sometimes those sensors have algorithm and data science platforms that are built in. Others might have things that are built on top of that. And then that would feed into some sort of data platform that more broadly talks about the patient. Next. So if anyone ever asked you, what's the best heart rate monitor, or what's the best blood pressure cuff, it would really be like asking what's the best drug or what's the best food. Like it doesn't, I don't know, like what do you need from that food? What do you need from that drug? What do you need from that heart rate monitor? And so what's really more important is making sure that things are fit for purpose and thinking about what are the elements that are important to you, and then how are you going to rank them based on other elements. So we'll talk broadly about 5 types of elements in the next section. One is around validation and what that means specifically for sensors. And the framework that we'll use is called the V3 framework, which splits out verification, analytical validation, and clinical validation of the connected sensor technology. Second is around security. Third is around data rights and governance, usability, and then cost, economic feasibility for using the products. And the way to think about this, one possible option is to think about this like a label. So we have labels for food, we have labels for drugs, and you may need some things over the other. And so as you go through this, whatever organization you work with, you'll probably develop your own perspective on which things are going to be important for your certain patient population for what you're looking to research. And if you haven't seen it yet, this morning, Stat News published a piece on labels for AI. So that this is a very timely piece, and more people are thinking about labels broadly. So our perspective here is definitely not doing a rating. So the same way, like if you just had calorie count, that's really not that useful necessarily if you don't know how the food is used. It's not about scoring one of these connected sensors and saying like this one's a 52 and this one's a 95. It's a lot of these things will need objective information. You'll need to have context. You'll need to have a multi-dimensional approach. And then it'll be important to think about what are your thresholds versus what's better or not. So you might kick something out just because it doesn't have something that you need. For example, maybe the company sues security researchers, which you've decided is not a type of security relationship that you would like to have. So you might have certain knockout points, or they don't have a level of clinical validation that you would need. And then others might be benefits or not across those. So it's a little interesting. Christine, how many more slides do I have for some of these? Because this is the last one. Yeah. Okay. So this is a much bigger section in the playbook, and I was thinking about how much of this we end up going into. I do think we have a lot more information around what V3 framework means. What do we mean by security? Data rights is a very important thing to separate from security itself, because security is really about somebody attacking a system. Data rights may not be an attack on a system. So things like Cambridge Analytica was not an attack on Facebook. That was misaligned incentives for how data were used, not like an unauthorized use case of it. And so it's also really important to think about data rights and not necessarily privacy, because in some instances, you might not want something to be private. You might want it to be interoperable and for it to be able to be shared. And so we have a preference for using the term data rights, where sometimes data rights results in privacy and sometimes data rights results in sharing. And that is an intentional decision largely driven by the patient and the decision makers who are involved in that data flow. And then there's a lot more here, and I think I will get through these slides faster so we can open this up for Q&A around usability and utility, and thinking through how you balance all of these different evaluations when you're using these tools in practice.
Yeah, if there are, and that ends the section going to apps, if there are specific questions around elements of that evaluation framework, I can go into the main playbook and pull the like relevant slides to address those questions in real time, I think. Cool.
Okay, over to me.
Yes, yep, operations.
Great. So I'm going to talk about the operational aspects of some of the considerations you may want to think about when deploying digital measures. Why don't we go to the next slide, and I think I'll center most of my examples around this before we go to the Q&A section. Cool. So for argument's sake for this section, let's assume that you've chosen a great technology after thinking carefully about what you want to measure, how you want to measure it. what are then the considerations for how to think about deploying it? I work primarily or almost exclusively in the field of developing new medicines. So we're governed specifically by the rules associated with running clinical trials, whether in the United States or globally. However, and getting back to our point of a heartbeat is a heartbeat, we want to think about these measures as consistent regardless of the way in which they're deployed. That doesn't necessarily mean that all the regulatory frameworks and other considerations function as seamlessly. So for example, and it's important to think about this when you walk through the stages of how you're going to get from sort of procuring devices through actually analyzing their data. So let's say, for example, I'm working in a study of a respiratory disease. We'll use that like asthma or COPD, and I want to use a Bluetooth spirometer to measure lung function in those patients. Most of the spirometers that are developed and marketed here in the United States are marketed for a care management or healthcare delivery situation. And that's great. It means that they've gone through some level of regulatory scrutiny that determines whether or not they meet certain claims. But just because a device is cleared by the FDA as a medical device for use in a care management setting in the United States does not automatically mean that it's going to be acceptable to ship that device into Canada or into the European Union. In fact, both the European Union and Canada are going to have their own regulations or paperwork, et cetera, even if I'm deploying this device into a clinical trial, where we need to provide certain assurances that that device is safe and acceptable for use in that context. I could give you endless permutations of this sort of issue. There are devices that are developed for research purposes, but wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to deploy in a clinical decision support context. So it's very important to think through this, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but there are many other practical and logistical considerations. So for example, just because the hospital or the researcher on the other side of the ocean is willing to agree, or the IRB is willing to agree that the device is okay, that doesn't mean that that device is going to survive making it through customs or whatever the other regulatory barriers are to get there. Many devices that we work with synchronize data via a mobile phone. We could spend an hour just talking about the differences between applications where you may want to invite patients to use their own phone versus where you deploy a provisioned phone. I work in standardized clinical research settings where we almost always deploy a standard phone to the patients. And that means making sure that we have cellular data plans and appropriate SIM cards for whichever geography we're operating in. These sound like mundane things, but the point that we're trying to get across is that it's really important to critically walk through all of these steps and relatively early in the process. So order matters here, but this is still something that you want to be doing relatively early, or it can create pain points later. Mm-hmm. So to talk a little bit more about what happens next, let's assume that we can get all of the devices and technologies that we want to all of the places that we want for our application. That's great. The next thing to think about is what is the sort of ecosystem that's involved with actually using and deploying it. Regardless of whether it is in a care delivery setting or a clinical research setting, for us, the person at the two people that are almost always at the end of the process here are nurses and patients. Research coordinators in our case are almost always nurses, not always. Patients are also providing data. Looking particularly from the standpoint of those coordinators or nurses, they're coming in and out of multiple software systems on a day-by-day basis. They're going in and out of different electronic medical record systems, possibly logging into different clinical trial data systems like metadata, rave, and so forth. And so when you come with additional technologies that you want to use in a given project, and let's particularly look at hardware, most pieces of hardware come with their own companion software applications. So for example, you might have that spirometer I mentioned, and it has an application that's meant to work with it. You might have an activity tracking wrist-worn device, and it's also going to have its own software application. Let's say your patients are involved in a clinical study where they're providing electronic patient-reported outcomes. They're doing that through their own computer, or are you working with a vendor that's providing them an Android smartphone that they're using as a diary or to answer questions? It's important to walk through each of these steps and to recognize the complexity and burden that's potentially happening at the end. And so are there opportunities to simplify this is always an important question. Many of these technologies have application programming interfaces or APIs or software development kits, which are known as SDKs, that can be used to integrate data into different systems. It's never possible to get folks in these situations down to one system. That's sort of a holy grail, particularly for the people that work on the healthcare delivery side, but making it as easy and seamless as possible for them to manage and interface with this technology is a critical part of our jobs. So thinking about how you might integrate that data, how to simplify it, and then really walking through the process of how are you going to train the people that actually need to use these technologies. We should assume that they are as diverse a population as the healthcare universe that we serve. And so operating from the common denominator of 30 or 40 something here in the United States and a relatively affluent background that's familiar with technology is not necessarily the frame of reference you want to be using if you're adapting to a diverse patient population and to the diverse community of users who deliver healthcare. So thinking about, just as when we write informed consent, we're supposed to write that language at a fifth grade level, and we often fail to do that, as many of us in research know. It's important to consider that as you walk through the aspects of developing things like a user acceptance test or training material, and truly ensuring that you have something that everybody who's participating in using your technology can follow and understand. So these are all key considerations up to deployment. Another point that we like to make is that, you know, you can deploy the greatest technology and have the greatest analytic plan, but if you don't get data from patients, it's probably not really worth the trip. So figuring out, if we are handing devices to people in any one of these settings, how do we make sure that we're actually monitoring and getting the data that we're expecting? It gets back to thinking through the software interfaces, but really the specific angle of how often are we able to check and make sure that things are working okay? What do people do if they have problems, if they run into issues? Once patients are home, let's say they're trained in the clinic, maybe not, maybe they're even trained at home. What happens when something doesn't behave as expected? What's the plan to be able to support that? And then finally, thinking through the closeout of any study. What are you going to do to capture and quality control the data? Do you have the right systems and tools to analyze it? In many cases, these technologies have the potential to generate data that's very different than what you would see in an electronic medical record or in a traditional clinical trial database. So understanding and having a plan for how to quality control that data and how to analyze that data is something that really has to happen early on in the process. And what I'm saying may sound obvious to some of you, but I can assure you that in my 6+ years of working specifically around these digital tools, I have on a number of occasions worked with very, very smart, very advanced pharmaceutical companies that have deployed technologies into clinical studies only to find at the end that they couldn't make sense of the data or that they didn't have the data compliance that they're looking for. So it is a very real and routine problem, but it can be addressed with appropriate foresight and planning. So just one more slide on this, and I think we'll be transitioning to Q&A. Cool. I think we have one more slide. The pro tip here, I really like these pro tip selections. If you're a stakeholder in this process in your organization, you really want to see, the simple thing you want to be asking for is a deployment plan. So everything I just talked about should fit under the umbrella of a deployment plan. And people who work in operational or technology roles should be familiar with what this is, what this term means. And so asking to see the deployment plan or asking to contribute to the deployment plan, that's really the mechanism by which you should be checking off the boxes to ensure that all of these systems are in place.
Awesome. I think there's one more slide but it just kind of reemphasizes some of the things that you said here, Chris, about the steps throughout. And then our next slide is promoting the next Playbook Masterclass session. So I'll leave it here and then throw it open to the Q&A.
And also for context, this was a subsection of 38 slides. So the overall playbook is about 400 slides. This section is about 150. So each of these bullets that you see have details of what is user acceptance testing actually mean. Like, you might have heard about it, but what does that thing look like? What are some examples of ones that you might use? One of the things that we're trying to balance on this meeting is like, how much in the rabbit hole do we go to versus not? And so we're going to keep it here, but have us go down the rabbit holes that you want to in the Q&A section.
Agreed.
I see there's a question from Cheryl, and I may just go ahead and take it if you guys don't mind, since it relates to something I was talking about. So it says, do technology manufacturers supply user acceptance testing data, at least in a general population? That's an awesome question. The answer is sometimes, not always. Sometimes, not always. So it is routine for device makers, certainly if you're developing a device for clinical care, for example. So not the Apple Watch, but you're developing a device that is specifically designed for medical purposes, that you would do some kind of testing there. It would typically be in healthy volunteers. And that's often a challenge as well, of things like algorithms that may be developed to assess things based on that data. So sticking with the example of a watch that would track activity or sleep, the algorithms that score whether or not someone is sleeping, they were developed in most cases in healthy volunteers. If you want to track sleep in children, if you want to track sleep in Alzheimer's patients or schizophrenic patients, the sleep architecture is incredibly different. And so you can't really rely on that validation data. Pediatric populations is something we encounter all the time. So occasionally you find devices that are specifically oriented toward pediatric use, but unfortunately, like so much in healthcare, pediatrics is often an afterthought. And so we find ourselves taking things that were designed for adults and trying to deploy them with children. There are formal processes for doing that kind of testing, usability testing, or also there are things like cognitive debriefing if you're using other instruments. And there are even companies that specialize in this. So it's the kind of thing that when you're thinking through this plan, if you find that there's a gap and something hasn't been usability tested, there are organizations that can go off and do that usability testing. If you deem formal usability testing to be required, it's not something that's terribly expensive, and it's something somewhat accessible. And in your experience, the technology would support additional UAT in more specific populations. I would like to say, Cheryl, that I would like to say that I would love to see more manufacturers seeking to do user acceptance testing across a wide variety of populations. Unfortunately, it's not always economically obvious why to do that. There are a lot of situations where people forego the user acceptance testing, unfortunately. It is in cases that are more specialized, like pharmaceutical and clinical research, where people tend to insist on it and are usually willing to pay for it. And I will get back to you with names of vendors on that. It's something I want to be careful about not answering off the top of my head, because I'm not the expert in my organization, but I'll get back to that for the chat.
I could take the one from Ravi on, so Ravi asked us, will the playbook cover deployment infrastructure for remote monitoring sensors? For example, if they connect to Wi-Fi, how do you ensure that connectivity is adequate? Mm-hmm. So one thing to think about is generally what the playbook does is it tees up the types of questions and the types of things that you will need to think about. Many of these might be different depending on the specific type of technology. So the playbook is not a specific review of individual technologies. So for Ravi's question, there's a section in the playbook that talks about the difference between connectivity and data. So thinking about Wi-Fi versus cellular versus Bluetooth, and thinking about like, how do you know that the Wi-Fi is set up in the home where you might need it? What if somebody's in the backyard? How are you communicating with that product if the Wi-Fi isn't available or it's dead? If the products go offline, how are you going to save the data? So thinking about storing and caching data. And then if you're collecting a lot of data, what happens if the product runs out of local storage? So those are like connectivity and data questions that you might want to consider. Second is around bandwidth. So even if you have connectivity, you might not have the speed that you need. So do you have, and what do you do when the bandwidth is going to be shifting over time, and how are you going to handle that in any different settings around that area? Another one that's often related to this is updates. So are there going to be software updates? If there's a security incident, will you be pushing updates? Do you need to get permissions to do that? Will you be reclaiming the products and then sending them back out if you can't ship updates, and how would you handle those? And then another data connectivity firewall issue is firewalls. So who gets access to products and when, and thinking about whitelisting URLs and when that might make sense or not. And so obviously you can imagine that each of these depends quite heavily on the context that you're in. And the goal for the playbook is for you to get a better sense of what are the unknown unknowns. So when you know that like connectivity is an issue, what are some of the related questions that you might need to consider as you're developing that deployment plan that Chris was talking about?
Fantastic. And let me try and make your life a little bit easier and see if I can tease out some of these terrific questions. Bernadette asked a question that Christine, I might toss to you if I can, around, is it best to establish a meaningful aspect of health for each disease, or can you do it generically?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I think this speaks to, especially in diseases like type 2 diabetes, or another one that comes to mind for me is rheumatoid arthritis. Maybe we have these lab values that we've used over time as an indication of how well a patient is doing with a specific disease. So for rheumatoid arthritis, there's a blood factor that is used. But does a change in that factor actually translate to a significant change in that patient's lived experience with the disease? So if you see a change in that blood factor, does that person's ability to walk improve? So I think by starting with what that patient truly cares about and what they want to see is important. For type 2 diabetes, like, are you looking at an improved A1C and like, does that have meaning for that patient? Or does that patient just, want to prevent hyperglycemia, prevent those lows during the day, and that's what they're telling you they want. So you can then tailor your measurement to that.
Christine, that was a fantastic answer. Thank you. There was a question from someone whose name I don't know, but I think it's a really good one given the scope of the playbook is about digital clinical measures. If they're not digital clinical measures, how would you define a sensor for remote medication adherence monitoring? And maybe Andy, I'll give that to you first and then I'll let the others weigh in and follow you. Oh, you're on mute. We win our Zoom bingo.
We win our Zoom bingo. So I think as much as I am somebody who really pushes for clear language, the other thing to think about is, why do you want to answer the question? So is that question being answered because you're interested broadly in medication adherence and you want to know if the playbook is something that would be helpful for you in that? I would say probably the technology, if that's the case, then the technology section would be more helpful. You might be thinking about security, data rights, how you're going to use it and deploy it. The measurement piece probably is less helpful. If the question is whether or not it's one of these tools for a regulatory purpose and whether or not you're going to be regulated using that tool and what types of regulation, then it's important to think about, we have I think Zoom changes. It's important to think about what the underlying intent for that question is.
Fantastic. I really like that, the use of language where it's sort of added value rather than sort of passing it out for the sake of it. And actually, Smith, I unmuted you. I'm going to try something new. If you can unmute yourself, you can go ahead and ask your question that you typed into the Q&A live to the gang.
Sure. Thank you, Jen.
Perfect.
Awesome. So I was curious about, with the rise in the digital biomarker development in specific therapeutic areas, like right now we have seen in neurology, psych, respiratory portfolio. What are some of the strategy or the thought process when an organization is building a biomarker in a specific disease state that doesn't have strong digital clinical endpoint in terms of, say, for example, triple negative breast cancer or other disease states?
I think
we're all being polite. Yeah. Do you want?
So one of the things we include in there is the sort of the definition of like a truly novel measure. And Smith, what you've really sort of like hit the nail on the head is this idea of a truly novel measure. There are ways we can do like combinations and permutations of existing sort of concepts that we now measure digitally. We can have existing measures that we now measure digitally. And you sort of frame down the most complex case, which is the trifecta of wanting to sort of measure something that's not been measured before, that links back to a concept that we've not previously been able to define in a given context of use while using a digital approach. And honestly, there's a sort of a slide in there that gives a hierarchy of evidence needed. That is the highest hierarchy of evidence needed. it still applies. We would still recommend the V3 framework. So we would still think about, if you're using a sensor, right, you're doing a digital process, you still have to show it's a good sensor. Whatever you define that measure to be, you still have to demonstrate that you are appropriately measuring it. And then the real kicker is, you're trying to probe a brand new concept. You have to develop a really, really rigorous body of clinical validation to show that what you are measuring, whatever biomarker it is you're digitally measuring, you can make a case to map that back to, you know, if it's triple negative breast cancer, you have to make that case. And it sounds intimidating, but we've done this for every other biomarker that we've developed. This is not brand new just because we're trying to measure it using a sensor. It's not easy to develop from the ground up a brand new novel biomarker, but for every assay we have, for every traditional wet lab biomarker we have, for every sort of pro we have right now, every COA, we have done this process. So it's definitely the highest bar, but the same rules still apply, although the burden of sort of building from the ground up is higher. Guys in the panel, I don't know if you want to riff off that at all.
I just want to add one thing that we've been talking about recently, and it started out as a point of frustration for me, but I've come to appreciate it. Looking at the frameworks for how patient-reported outcomes or COAs are validated is important, and the regulators, particularly the FDA, will encourage you to do so. And there really is, in many cases, the need for qualitative and quantitative research to actually support how meaningful things are to patients, and there are methodologies that can be followed there, because you're really not, you know, in some cases, for example, you hit the nail on the head, validating a pulmonary function test at home or in the clinic, there's already an acceptance that the pulmonary function test is a good measure in certain respiratory diseases. But in other cases, there's a much more significant difference to that digital measure or its application in a condition like breast cancer, or where it wouldn't have traditionally been thought of. And so gathering that other data, and again, voice of the patient in a methodical way, is really, really important. And I would suggest that even though sometimes the PRO guidances are cumbersome, and I think that there's room for flexibility, they're a good source of reference for how to think about that, because that's the methods people have used to establish kind of functional burden and impact on activities of daily living.
So the way that the playbook is helpful here is it splits out like what is a concept versus what is the measurement process that you're using, and then what is the measure that pops out from there. And there's, I think we all paused because there's about a 50-page part in this where we weren't sure like how in depth we should go. It starts on slide 78 if you would like to look at that one. And then it splits out effectively if you're using a known measure in a new population, if you're digitizing a known measure, or if it's a new type of measurement process in a new population and a new way of calculating all of it. And so there's different ways to go through that. The other cool thing about the playbook is in many of these instances, all the question is like, what's the evidence? Like, are you comparing to something else, or is there a gold standard or a reference standard, or is that something that you have to create from scratch? Again, for reference, when Jen was saying we, that was not a company we, that was like a community society we. What the playbook does is this pulls from many different sources. So the Clinical Trial Transformation Initiative has amazing resources on novel endpoints in development, and there's a number of other groups that do that. So in that section, it pulls from best in industry across multiple peer review papers, regulators, and other resources. So you can dive in, and it'll be more specific depending on the context that you're thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can summarize that with, just because you can measure something doesn't mean that you necessarily should. It should be grounded in what your patients are telling you, and keep patient engagement early and often throughout that process.
Fantastic. Smith, that was a humdinger of a question. I love it. We really sort of teased out, I think, some of what the best of the playbook has to offer. And it's a hard question, but an important one. I'm going to see David Snyder, if I can unmute you, if you would like to pose your question directly to the gang. You should be able to unmute yourself at your end now, David.
Can you hear me now?
We got you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to put something into the chat, which I was just taking some notes on. Let me copy and paste this real quick. I think I've not been through the entire 402 pages, but it's an ecosystem question. So let me see if I can put this here. Come on. May or may not copy in. No, it's not letting me copy in, and so I'll just talk to it. You know, I met Andrea and a couple others at the Biohacking Village at DEF CON last year. And when I look at the playbook, it seems there's a lot of discussion of cybersecurity for the individual devices and at the individual device level. But I'd like to see some thought given to a holistic view at the ecosystem level, because what you have is a chain of data transmission from device through the internet to a platform and then to a healthcare delivery organization and then a clinician. And I'd like to see a little thought given to the concern that a compromise at one of those components can result in an opportunity for a bad guy to move laterally to another component in the chain.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure how that coordination is going to be achieved. There is the HIPAA Business Associate Agreements guidance, but I'm not sure that's sufficient. So I just want to raise that as a point to maybe think about the ecosystem holistically. It's not just at the device level.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to think about. So one is we think about a technology ecosystem, but even that is largely around a patient. So there's the sensor, and then that sensor to the data platform to the other. So there are multiple places where those data go. I think one of the most important things for everyone to think about is if it's connected to the internet, it is hackable. And so I was in a meeting with a pharma company. They're like, we just want to use unhackable products. If you want to use unhackable products, they should be not connected to the internet ever. If you're connecting to the internet, it's really about figuring out if you've been compromised and when, and how to make sure that that does not happen very often, if almost never, and how you're going to handle it when it does, and that it's limited in scope. One of the things that the playbook doesn't do today is if you have a whole set of these products, they're effectively IoT, right? So if you have many of these out in a system, you could not even just have the ecosystem around a patient where that data is going to multiple things. But what if you have many patients across many IoT products? And there are definitely IoT level cybersecurity risks that right now we do not cover in the playbook. If you are interested, this is why we want a tour of duty. There are infinite questions as we start going through this. And so it's important for us to prioritize what are going to be the most important ones. And we would love your thoughts to join for tour of duty, the next tour of duty, to help us flesh out some of these things.
Well, thanks. I'm definitely looking at that.
Great question, David and Andy. A terrific way to sort of address that. Kevin, I've unmuted you. If you can unmute yourself, you can ask your question live if you're somewhere you can talk.
Yes, thanks, Jen.
Terrific.
Chris, I think you made a comment earlier about, just because something is 510K cleared by the FDA doesn't necessarily make it a good sensor or wearable to use for a clinical trial endpoint. Is 510K clearance basically meaningless, or does it have any weight whatsoever when you're beginning to choose kind of a technology?
Yeah, Andy taught me a lot about this, but certainly in the context of clinical trial application, I can offer a few comments. So it's really important to read the 510K documents. They're searchable on FDA.gov, and look at exactly how the device was validated. There is a lot of variability in how devices may be validated to get a 510K clearance. And so it's really worth understanding specifically what was done and to make sure that it meets the conditions to satisfy you or your partners in terms of how you want to implement it. With that being said, having a 510K clearance does count, if you will, in conversations with IRBs, with many sponsors and stakeholders. They view it as a level of reassurance. However, I think that in many cases, they are overconfident in what the 510K clearance means, and you are best to do your own digging and really have a true understanding of what that validation evidence was, because so often it's simply comparing that you do something the same way as a quote unquote predicate device that appears to be similar and may or may not be. Or for example, very often, back to my example of a spirometer, they'll be tested against one another by putting them in a box and blowing air through it with a machine that tells you how much air went through as ground truth. It's very different than putting the device in the hands of a human being and seeing whether or not they can use that device to do a pulmonary function test. That would be an example of a difference between something that would get you 510K clearance versus what I would want to have in the way of evidence before deploying something in a clinical trial.
Jen, could I briefly show the picture? Because I think this might be helpful for folks. I have the slide pulled.
That's a great idea. Yeah, please, Andy.
Okay. So you do not need to have a 510K cleared product to submit a measure in a registered clinical trial. That doesn't mean that it's not helpful, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that it is helpful. So just because something is 510K cleared does not mean that it works.
Mm-hmm.
And the other nice thing, Andy, just to riff on that, we also have a similar slide with regards to trials in Europe and what a CE mark means. So that's all in there for you. And Kevin, it's a great question and a common question. So that's exactly the kind of thing we tried to tackle. Sarah, I was going to try and squeeze your question in, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know we are all in back-to-back virtual meetings these days. So with that, I just want to first of all, I know there are a few unanswered questions. Let's move that across to the DIME Slack. We can all be present there. If you want to ping them in the Q&A channel, we can dive in. We can answer those questions for you. If you have suggestions for us for continuing to develop the slide deck and the playbook, there is a feedback form. This is a draft for public comment. That's at playbook.dimesociety.org, along with an opportunity to sign up for the next tour. I want, before we talk about what's coming next in our Playbook Masterclass series, I also just want to pause for a second and thank you, Christine, Chris, and Andy. Really terrific session today. You covered the lion's share of the playbook in an hour. It was engaging and it was really useful to expose everyone on the line to the sorts of resources that are available. Thank you everyone on the line for terrific questions. And the series does continue through the fall. We have 6 sessions addressing different topics in the playbook. Next week, John Wilbanks and Dina Mendelsohn will be joined by a guest star for a very, very important topic. We're going to be thinking about equity and justice with regards to remote monitoring. We will have a D&I expert on this too, joining John and Dina. We hope you can join us. We thank you for your time this afternoon. And for anyone interested in the next tour of duty, we look forward to chatting with you about that possibility. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for coming.